Does it stay on or you have to hold it up? Tap it, okay. Good afternoon. How heavy was lunch? Super. So how many will you doze off? How many of you will doze off? None? Not possible. I'm just wondering how will I do this 2-minute justice when I introduce the speaker today. And sorry, I think today, how many of you got caught up in traffic in the morning if you were staying somewhere else? Oh yes, man. You saw the worst of Delhi. And how about yesterday evening? Again, a lot many. In the morning when I arrived here, it took me about 20 minutes, 18 and a half minutes. On the way back, it took me 1 hour, 40 minutes. So it was interesting to see how the time plays. We'll wait for Ramesh. I hope none of you want to do some stretches. Any Zumba instructor here? Or enthusiast is also fine. How many attended Presidential Forum yesterday? Ramesh's talk yesterday? Okay. So there is a repeat fan following. Okay. And how many of you Googled him when you went back home? Okay. How many heard his talks? Okay. I completely forgot that I had to write an introduction piece, which I did in the morning, because I just got caught up in just listening on the repeat. So here's a speaker. Thank you. Yes, I'm just introducing. How do you prefer? What do you prefer, the mic or this one? That's like here, or
I'll use this.
You'll use this so that you can.
Can people hear me? So we can just switch it on. There you go.
Yes, I think just cut the long story short. I'm Sameer Arora, Shivnada School Vice Principal at Gurgaon campus, and just been IC3 volunteer since 2017. And of course, once you attend IC3, you're never the same, right? You keep evolving. So I think yesterday's conversation was very interesting. And I was telling them that how many of them Googled you yesterday, Ramesh? So I think there quite a number of hands went up. How many of them Googled you yesterday, including me?
I have no idea.
Yeah. So we did that count check for you.
You did?
We did. We did that.
Really?
Yes. So I think we still have some people coming in.
Yeah, everybody, come on, join us.
Come on, join us quickly. And dozing is allowed. Snoring is not. Okay? So if a snoring problem, you can go at the back. I was telling them, and I said I got so caught up in listening to your talks that I forgot that I have to introduce you. So in the morning in the car, I was sitting down and writing your introduction. So pardon me, just in case I just miss out something. So I think from the yesterday's talk, I picked up some key points. And I think, one of the key points was he talked about that how technology, which is an equalizer, which is intending to unite us, is basically dividing us. But I think a person like him is a beacon of hope, working tirelessly to bridge the gap between innovation and humanity. That's what he said. So Ramesh Srinivasan is not just a scholar, a thought leader. He's a humanist at heart, driven by the belief that technology should serve all of us and not a privileged few. His work transcends borders, blending the rigor of an academic with an empathy of a storyteller to ensure that the digital world we build is a more just, inclusive, and democratic. From advising global leaders and policymakers, his mission is clear: to repair the disconnected between the creators and the users, the powerful and the marginalized, and to give the way for a future where technology empowers rather than divides. As we navigate the complex digital landscapes of our time, he reminds us of shared humanity, urging us to design a world where everyone's voice is heard and valued. He could easily be using his education from some of the most elite institutions, Stanford undergraduate, MIT graduate, Harvard postdoc, for personal gain, perhaps creating the next billion-dollar startup or basking in the glory of tech's glittering world. But no, he decided a different path for himself, one where he uses his vast knowledge and expertise not for his own good, but for the greater good of humanity. He launched his new podcast, Utopias. I just sort of started following him. I just did one. It was really, really exciting. He's also author of 3 interesting books already on my reading list. Asked my library to get 5 copies each. Whose Global Village? Rethinking How Technology Impacts Our World. After the Internet, and the Forbes top 10 tech book Beyond the Valley. Through these works, he's constantly advocating for digital landscape that is democratic, inclusive, just, and challenges us to think differently about the world we're living in. He's the. I had an opportunity to attend his presidential forum yesterday, and I must tell you, man, my vocabulary and my thought process about technology are richer and challenged. Some of the terms I remember: digital capitalism, never heard of it before. Psychographic manipulation, of course, you're all victim to that. Algorithmic violence, my God, it's just blown off my mind. So I'm just going to go back and my school of life to read a little more about that. I signed up for one course yesterday on MIT website. As an educator, he has advised for us to teach children not just the STEM, but digital literacy, algorithmic literacy, data literacy, AI, metaverse, and cryptocurrency. And the world is generally divided. It's in a polarized world, you generally have two groups. There are some like us who are sitting on the fence. Some days we are on the left, some days we are on the right. So raise your hand if you fantasize about technology and supporting and serving us in our lifetime. You believe that technology will serve us in our lifetime, making our life easier, efficient, and effective. How many of you believe that? Okay, you've got a good number, Ramesh. Good. The second group, if you have a sense of anxiety about technology and AI taking over our lives and eventually dooming our social and cultural fabric, there is a good number here as well. But Ramesh, he would say technology doesn't define our future, we do. With that, let's call him for his talk, Glimpses of Utopia, How Technology Can Support Planetary Life. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Samir. And can we turn this off so it doesn't double microphone, huh? Okay.
Turn this off, or we can just tap.
Oh, tap, okay. Sometimes technology is very simple. So what I'm going to do, we have about an hour. I'm going to try to speak through some of the work I'm looking at, particularly honing in on artificial intelligence. As Samir mentioned, I have lots of different hats. I look at environmental issues. I work in open air markets around the world. I work with indigenous communities, many different aspects to what I work on, and we can explore those. And most importantly, this is not about the I, even though I'm going to be speaking as an I. This is more about the gifts and blessings I've received as a former engineer, traveling around the world. I've had the blessing of being in about 75 countries, working with different populations, living in different countries. Sometimes, I mean, maybe many of us feel this, like we've lived many lives at this point. And so for me, I'm really, really blessed to be with all of you, to be at the IC3 conference. I want to thank Michelle, in particular, my colleague from the University of California system, for inviting me here, as well as Ganesh and Preeti for their kindness in having me here. I love being in Delhi, and I love being in India. I was born in the US, but India is my home as well, you know, so we're a mix of many things. I'm Tamil American, just so you know. So these are some ways you can keep up with what I'm doing. I'm not very good at self-promotion in the sense that I'm kind of old media. I do a lot of talks, I do a lot of TV, news, etc. But I'm pretty terrible with social media. And my podcast, we're trying to deal with this. But this is a way you can follow me on pretty much all platforms, including TikTok, which I know is not here. And that's my site, which shows a lot of what I've been up to. So what I want to do is, for about the first 30 or 40 minutes, well, we're at 2:25, take you through some big questions I think that we're grappling with when it comes to the onset of generative AI, which is only about 2 years old, a little less than 2 years old, when the kind of cat came out of the bag and we were all wondering, what the heck is this ChatGPT thing and all these other platforms that are emerging. I'm going to break this down a little for you from my perspective, knowing fully well that I don't know everything. In some ways, I don't know anything, right? And we're going to figure these things out together. But this is one way you can keep up with what I'm up to, that Samir generously mentioned. This is the podcast. It's on every platform. And it's a labor of love. We don't have any commercials on it. That's the hope, even though that means less promotion. And I've had wonderful people on it, from philosophers to monks to activists to journalists to artists. And the key point of this podcast, just like all of my work, including a new book I was working on a proposal the last few hours, is to get back to the light. This idea of what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be alive? and doubling down on some core facets of life: creativity, care, compassion, karuna, these sorts of practices. And these are the stories I attempt to tell through the podcast, through these really fun conversations I'm having. I've even had people in the United States Congress, believe it or not, join me on this podcast. Really prominent folks of all walks of life: women, men, transgender, doesn't matter. Anti-discrimination in all facets. And then we want to think about technology accordingly. And this is the first thing I want to say. Most stories about technology shouldn't really be about technology. In fact, none of our conversations about technology should be about technology. They should be about life. They should be about humanity. And I think right now we're struggling at a moment where most of our understandings and definitions of technology have been essentially encapsulated, co-opted, I don't know if it's intentional or not, by big tech, right? But remember, most of these companies are babies. They're like 20 years old or so. Some of my friends are very senior in these companies. And, you know, what that means is we get placed in these cycles of fantasy and euphoria and anxiety. And these things have a cyclical relation with one another. But the common aspect to our lives, I believe, in relation to big tech is the inscrutability, the inability to understand what the heck is going on. What's being collected about us? Who's doing that collecting? How long is that stuff, that data being collected about us? How much of our lives can actually be expressed through data, through binary integers? How is data being aggregated, right? Data might be collected about me right now as I'm sitting with all of you, performing a particular role and identity. But what about data being collected about me at 3 in the morning when I'm getting whiskey on the street? Do I want that to be collected? That doesn't happen. But think about that, right? The notion of identity and self is relational. It's contextual. And we should have that right as human beings to be ourselves in different contexts. But if all of this is being collected and being used in recursive ways to feed back to us, to construct desire, to construct consumption, to modify behavior, that to me is a violation. And this is a huge issue that I'm trying to deal with on many, many levels. So I'm going to break this down in a few different ways, but I want to start this story about 20 years ago. I was a student of one of the founding fathers of artificial intelligence. His name is Marvin Minsky. He was very interested in our classes at this question of what intelligence is and how to build artificial intelligence systems. And much of this was built upon the idea that the mind is the basis of intelligence and rationality is the basis of intelligence. So what we were attempting to do in our classes is try to understand how the mind/brain, which is not exactly the same thing, operate rationally, axiomatically, and try to build software that emulated those processes, if that makes sense. We can have a conversation about this once I wrap up, and I'm down to hang out as long as people want to hang out with me. And this was a big question. And in this class, I asked Professor Minsky, this is a cool thing about our classes, this was at MIT. I asked Professor Minsky, what about emotion? Emotional intelligence, which we know Daniel Goleman, other Nobel Prize winners have uncovered this. How much of that is being articulated here? What about irrationality? We know as human beings, this is award-winning work. Daniel Kahneman, the late great Daniel Kahneman, Dan Ariely, my colleague, has uncovered this type of work. We know that's a core aspect to human behavior, human life. We could even say human intelligence. Is that being covered here? What about non-humans? I don't know if you consider flocks of birds that fly in particular patterns as intelligent on a collective level, or orcas that have decided to adapt and attack fossil fuel ships as a type of intelligence. Certainly adaptation from a Darwinian perspective, and quick adaptation, but it's what we call distributed cognition. So Minsky got mad at me for asking these questions. Not mad, but he was sort of like, you're a hippie, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to think very openly about these questions. So these were the flashpoints of artificial intelligence 20 or so years ago. Okay? Now, where are we at? That's the next question. Where are we at? Well, every major technology company now describes itself as an AI company. And what is behind that? It's basically the core issue of our times, which is everything and anything is being represented, think about that term, represented through datafication. Almost anything we do leaves digital footprints. These are terms we use. Data traces, right? These cameras can capture that. Biometric systems capture that. Amazon surveillance cameras capture that. Fitbits we wear capture that. Neuralink, heaven forbid, if we like that or not, you already know my feelings, captures that. This is brain-machine interfaces. Our credit cards capture that. Aadhaar card captures that. Remember the world before the Aadhaar card? I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just representing it. Anything to do with our phones capture that. So this is what we call everything of life can be represented through a series of quantified numbers. And so what has happened? Datafication, data collection, data retention, data aggregation. But then what's happening with all this data? It's such exquisite amounts of data collected at all times, and also collected by about non-humans, like Internet of Things, infrastructures, climate data. It's all being captured, which is why we're talking about massive energy associated with such, and it means the world of AI is one of pattern recognition, correlation. So think about that. Correlation, pattern recognition is a subset of mathematics. It's actually a part of applied mathematics. Literally, it's what I studied as an undergraduate. How much of our intelligence is limited to pattern matching? Is that it for intelligence? I'm not saying these are systems that cannot represent human behavior and human activity exquisitely, but I'm saying the processes are even more detached from what we feel and believe and how we think as human beings. Okay, so with that said, what is actually occurring is what I believe is what we might call behavioral mimicry. The algorithms sometimes by critics are described as stochastic parroting algorithms. Stochastic means, for those of you who are like math nerds, are probabilistic inferences. That's what stochastic means. Parroting, what do parrots do? You say something, they say it back, right? This is a level of behavioral mimicry and stochastic parroting on a level we've never, ever, ever seen before, which is why possibly these technologies are super convincing in such a way that they can emulate human beings. But now, because these data sets are so massive, astronomical, and the calculating systems that pushes information out from them are so powerful, you can basically tell an inscrutable, astronomical data set, make this decision, make that decision, and you don't really understand, none of us will truly understand the bases by which those decisions are made, which is why we are starting to see emergent effects of these systems starting to lie to us to ultimately achieve their own outcome. We're also seeing examples of systems trying to develop their own languages to interface with one another that are inscrutable to us. So this is what drives what I call the Terminator scenario, which my colleagues like Yuval Harari, many of you know his book Sapiens, has been he's kind of freaking out about it, in my opinion. He's really overdoing it. But that's what gets attention, because we live in a world also triggered by social media where the sensational gets more attention and the sensational often goes more viral. And I'm not saying he's a sensationalist. I just think in the here and now, there are so many issues tied to these dynamics of generative AI that we can actually get our heads around rather than worry about Frankenstein being born and taking the planet over. You've all heard that critique, I'm sure, or that fear. So in reality, we're at an incredible moment where companies that describe themselves as technology companies have taken over most facets of life. And most of them are in the business of owning almost nothing and hiring almost nobody. No offense intended. I have lots of friends at these companies. And I've spoken at Google and stuff before, saying this in front of them. And that's interesting, right? Like, think about Uber. Is Uber a technology company or a taxi company? Well, it's both. It's the biggest taxi company, though, in the history of the world. And every transaction we make, whether it's Airbnb, Uber, Amazon/Alibaba, etc., are companies where we are, that basically are intermediaries, we call them platforms, that are basically taking a cut out of every peer-to-peer transaction, but more importantly, they're grabbing the data. And that data itself forms the vertical for new forms of valuation, which is why we've seen an inverse correlation, I'll talk about this later, between profitability at times and valuation. Amazon did not make a penny for the first decade of its existence. Uber only started making money recently. Uber's been around a long time, right? So we have to consider what is actually occurring here. The efficiency of technology might actually generate mass-scale macro inefficiencies, which is an interesting ironic point. It's sort of entropic in a sense. And this is what I was just talking about, right? So I'm definitely not a doomsdayer. I'm just setting up the schema here. But, you know, this is the International Monetary Fund of all people. We're not talking about some progressive left institution here, is warning that many jobs as we know it are likely to be transformed, turned obsolescent, some of them, and that we need to think about not just the future of work, but the future of workers, if work is to be the future, or perhaps more importantly, the future of economic security and economic life, right? And we can dive more into these questions in a moment, or in a few moments. Because I want to set this all up giving you this sort of sobering insight. Some of you, most of you are not Americans, so whatever. But these are trends we're seeing in the United States and actually also in the United Kingdom. For the first time in the history of the United States, the youngest generation, your students, and some of you have students in the US, maybe even at UCLA, where I teach, are the first to make less than their parents, even if you control for inflation, which we know is quite high. Right? We've all been facing that. So even if you control for inflation, we're seeing a descending curve of economic life. And this is pretty interesting. Anecdotally, I've had students for over 15 years at UCLA. I have students coming back to me and saying, hey, Prof, I'm driving for Uber after a UCLA degree, part of the gig economy. And there's some evidence that gig work is also capturing data that can be fed into automated systems, right? As we know, robots don't have to unionize. Robots don't need to be paid living wages, which is what I want everybody to have. Robots don't need to have health care. Maybe a little oil here. So this is sort of where we're heading. So what I want to speak about are what we actually mean by innovation. Does innovation mean like a few people make astronomical amounts of money, build technologies that dazzle us but also make us anxious, we don't fully understand them, and the rest of us are like, what the heck is going on? Is that innovation? Is innovation resourcefulness? Doing more with less? What do we mean by that? Disruption, innovation. What do we even mean by the cloud? Data goes to the cloud, right? But the cloud are a set of proprietary data servers that consume massive amounts of energy. Do clouds actually do that? So we have to think beyond metaphor and beyond discourse and beyond branding to something deeper. So in my last book, which I published on the 50th anniversary of the internet, 2019, October, the internet started. First node of the internet was on my campus in 1969 at UCLA. I had a chance to interview Sam Altman because he's 1 degree separated from me in a million different directions. He's a Stanford grad, I'm a Stanford grad. And at that time, you all know Sam is the co-founder, along with Elon Musk, of OpenAI, behind ChatGPT and so on. But I interviewed Sam not so much, he didn't tell me that ChatGPT was coming out quite the way it was. When he kind of dazzled us by it. But I did ask him and interview him because he was giving some of his own money. He's a billionaire. And he was the former head of Y Combinator, which is a huge incubator in Silicon Valley. But I was asking him about his funding of universal basic income studies. Why are you doing that, Sam? What does that mean? So universal basic income is one of many proposals that's actually existed for centuries. Believe it or not, I can talk to you about that more, that pays people some small amount every month. In the US, my friend Andrew Yang proposed that he ran for president 4 years ago. He's one of my guests on the podcast. That's a great conversation we have about data rights, unionization, AI. He proposed that. Universal basic income was one of many approaches that is supposed to give people a little bit of money every month, recognizing, as Sam did, that the economy might be turning more and more feudal. Right? Platform owners, monetization, subject to architectures that we don't really understand. And at the end of the day, if we don't all have some money, we can neither be consumers, which is important for many companies, obviously, but also critically, our data may not be worth that much, right? So I was asking him about this, and we talked a little bit about this, and one of the main things he expressed to me is that what people actually do, most empirical studies show, working class people across racial dynamics, etc., what this money that they get through UBI, it turns out most of them use that money for the core facets like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, food, health, etc. So this whole narrative that people just spend it on booze, on drugs, on whatever, has not been shown to be true through most empirical studies. Yet at the same time, as we think about technologies, technology companies, their valuation and so on, often we don't consider what Nobel Prize winner Elinor Ostrom has called externalities. I'm being a little academic here. So basically, often we have narrow economic calculations associated with phenomenon, but we don't consider the effects of that narrow transaction. So for example, maximization of automobile production in Flint, Michigan. Oh my gosh, that ended up polluting the river with lead. Oh my gosh, we didn't consider that. Or maybe they did. So that ends up creating a reinforcement mechanism that actually ends up challenging everybody, including the auto manufacturers themselves. This is part of why we have to conceive of technology in highly systemic ways. And one thing Sam has called for, which got a lot of attention and some outrage, is $7 trillion fund to fund super microchips and the energy sources, the energy resources. So look, this might be called a cloud. This might be seen as a device that stands alone, but it's actually a heterogeneous assemblage of rare earth minerals, right? Extracted from different parts of the world. It's a device that's designed to die. They call it planned obsolescence. Apple, not that different than a Monsanto seed, another bioengineered technology, right? And it uses so much energy as well. And when this dies, where does it go? So things are extracted from the earth, Congo, Afghanistan, Bolivia for lithium, etc., to form this thing that we treat as a black box or white cube. And then what happens after? It comes from the planet, the earth, and returns to the planet. So what we're actually talking about is an earthly technology here. So I'm sort of setting this up for you to discuss what we could do. Some of you who've talked to me know that I'm extremely influenced by, probably the biggest influence on me intellectually is the philosopher Achille Mbembe. It's really cool to bring Achille into these contexts for me. Most of you probably have not heard of Achille. He's one of the most prominent contemporary political philosophers, but he's a philosopher of life, of ecology, of science, of technology, based in South Africa. And Achille has this very compelling question that he asks, which is, how do we care for and repair this planet and our lives? Not because things are broken or destroyed, but we know at this time there's massive amounts of climate refugees, for example. We know that the US's terrible actions, I'm just telling you my views, around the planet have led to massive migration, including to the southern border of Mexico and Guatemala, not just the border of the US. So given these conditions, how do we think strategically, creatively, analytically about a world that supports all beings? So I'm bringing Achille up because I think that's the guiding philosophy by which we can conceive of technology. Because technologies are vectors of mediating life futures. I'm quoting Achille here. Okay? So Achille is based in Johannesburg. He's one of Africa's most famous contemporary political philosophers. He was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, Columbia, blah, blah, blah. And these are questions that he's asking. So what I want to do is speak to what I believe are 3 types of technologies that actually can bring us back to life. Bring it all back. Recognizing, as my colleague Doug Rushkoff, who's written about 20 books on technology, says, being human is a team sport. He has a book called Team Human and a podcast called Team Human. Being human is a team sport. Or another thing I'd like to say is life is not about containment, individuation, feeling alone, feeling isolated. Life is about relating. Relating to ourselves, meditation, spiritual practices. Relating to one another, connections, relationships. Relating to the planet, non-humans, regeneration, right? So what I want to do is give you 3 sets of lenses by which we might think of ourselves having glimpses of utopia. Little glimpses, little peeks. And then, because I kept this fairly short, we can have a conversation. First, where does all this stuff go? Where does it go? We talk about Jugad a lot here in India, right? If I had more time, I'd be going chilling at, I don't know if I'd chill, but I'd be going hanging out at Chandni Chowk, right? Who wants to come with me? It turns out this is from the Gikomba market in Kenya, in Nairobi. I go and hang out in these markets. I'm the only non-African usually you see anywhere. And this is where it all goes. And so the interesting question is, what is done with such? Recognizing it, these are what we call vectors of asymmetry, right? Like what flows where? For those of you who are Americans or heard of the Super Bowl, what happens to the caps of the team that loses the Super Bowl? You know, they make thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of shirts, caps, etc. Cricket, we can come up with an equivalent. They make them for both sides, right? So they're ready to sell. What happens to those who lose? Where does this go? Well, it turns out it doesn't go everywhere. It often ends up in places like Ghana, Kenya, Ethiopia, sometimes here in India, Haiti, with a lot of clothes. This is where these things go. And what happens at this point? Well, I've been hanging out with people like David. David is in Gikomba Market. He's an expert on capacitors, just capacitors. You're like, what's a capacitor? Why should I care? This is the interesting thing I see in such markets. David is an expert on capacitors, but he knows everyone else in the market who can help with other aspects of repairing and recycling and upcycling and regenerating technologies, breathing life into that which is dead, bringing value to that which is waste. Think about that, the cyclicality. We know this as Hindus, Buddhists, whatever we are. We know that life exists karmically, cyclically, right? So this is the same thing I see in action in markets. And then this can turn into something completely different. And I've written a little bit about this for Wired. Okay, I'll start here. Anyone know what this is right here? Yeah, you knew it, Samir. This is a 3D printer that came out of this same market. It came from this same market. So I have friends in Nairobi who call themselves Jua Kali. Jua Kali means, in Swahili, means hot sun. We know this in Chandni Chowk, other places. A table, a soldering gun. These are not people with exquisite degrees from fancy IIT universities like the places I went, or some of us went. These are people who learn by doing. Learn through atelier, apprenticeship. Learn by playing. Think about that as a model of learning. And out of all waste, they've been able to create 3D printers. Now, some of you might know that these 3D printers, look at this material right here. Some of you might know that these 3D printers are made of a type of plastic that's called filament, right? These guys can't afford a filament. They're not going to buy it on Amazon or whatever, have it shipped at huge expense. How are they able to create the filament by which they print the 3D printers? Super recursive, right? Through trash plastic bottles, they're clamping them, and so it's convection and compression, 2 thermodynamic properties, at least the latter. And through that, they're able to create filament out of trash and waste. But then you might be, who cares about a 3D printer, right? Like, whatever, it's a fetish, right? Sort of a total tech fetish in a way. It's not about the 3D printer. It's about what you print with the 3D printer. Check this out. What do you think this is? Who wants to guess? Not Samir, since he knows all the answers. Who wants to guess what this is? It's not fully formed yet, but what do you think goes on top of it? Anyone want to try? Microscopes. Thousands of microscopes sitting in schools. Many of you are school teachers, school principals, that never would have afforded a microscope before. Think about that. I start with waste, trash, garbage thrown out by the West, built upon a consumption model that is based upon the death and life of technology, programmed seeds like we see with Monsanto, etc. These guys are repairing. Think about the word repair. I'm really into etymology. Repairing, taking things that were stripped apart, bringing it back together. You got it. Regenerating, taking it, generating it again, right? This is really interesting. And now these guys are also printing medical devices with these, including parts that are going to go into the body. And they're also printing like cool ornaments they have something called matatus there, which are like pretty fun, but really I'm too tall for them. You know, the matatus. So matatus are these crazy collective vans of transport that you just stand on a street corner, you hail it, you get in, and then you squeeze like that. And they can fit about 22 people. I once counted it into a matatu. Every part of my body is like touching someone else or something. And they have Bob Marley matatus, Nas, the hip hop artist, matatus, Mandela matatus, different matatus. It's like a fun social thing. So they're even printing ornaments for matatus, right? So this is the idea of how you can create cyclical economies, what are often called circular economies, even by Davos, those people, you know? So this is a really, really creative point. But this all rests on the back of a world where we have made invisible the externalities associated with narrow transactional technology. So there's hopes, there's rays of utopia here, right? So this is the first set of technologies that I'm going to be writing about extensively. I'm giving you a teaser for like this new book that I'm working on. The second are technologies, I would argue, of interconnection. And I'm just giving you specific examples. We can talk about more of them. This is my friend Osvaldo. Osvaldo is in Oaxaca, Mexico. That's one of the main places I live and I work in. I speak Tamil, like not very well. And it's a funny thing. I was just traveling for the last couple of weeks in Tamil Nadu, and while I was trying to say Tamil, Spanish words would come out of my mouth. Because my Spanish is much better than my Tamil. And Osvaldo is an indigenous elder. He's not that old, but an indigenous leader. He's Zapotec. And he realized, like many others in that area, that they needed technologies to bring their community together, maintain the language. Most of those indigenous languages are oral because of colonialism. And these guys all were playing with radio comunitaria, community radio. And then they said, why don't we try to apply the same vision toward cell phone networks? And because of a clause in the Mexican Constitution, it was legal to create these networks. Thus was born a project called Teléfono Indígena Comunitaria. I can't say that in Tamil. Indigenous community telephony, right? So what has happened is there are 63 independent sovereign community digital networks where communities in high altitude rainforests and all around the country, and now they're expanding into other countries, are building their own sovereign digital networks. And with these phone networks, they all own it. Any employment stays in the community. Any protocols around security, data privacy stay in the community. They can call one another across their community and the 63 others for free. They can call relatives in the United States. Many Oaxacan people are living near me in LA, in the Central Valley. I have been on both sides of these phone calls, right? Because I live in Los Angeles. They can call folks in cities where they might be selling crops. This is a classic story from India around tech, right? Bypassing middlemen, jamindars, things like that, right? So more efficiency, but also greater self-determination, and could also say collective determination. So why am I saying that? Because the medium of connection are written by and for people. That's why I call these technologies of interconnection. And I want to tell you something that I think is kind of interesting with what happened with this initiative. Okay. Is these communities, this is Iktakop, another network like this. Iktakop means words in the wind. Palabras en el viento. Words in the wind. Think about that. They're conceiving of digital networks, community networks, in this sort of way, with these sorts of metaphors. But then I was talking to them. I've known these guys for several years. I've written about them in my last book. I've written about them for the media as appropriate. I try not to study people. I study entanglements of life and technology, we could say, right? They said, wait a second, more people online, more people with cell phone networks. We realize that that's important. But at the same time, I don't know if our goal really is to have more people on Instagram, more people on WhatsApp. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but we know all that, the Googles and Facebooks love these projects, right? Because the more people that are online, the more people that are on their networks, and the more people that are in their data capture, modes. I would call it surveillance capitalist modes. So, so they basically said the question for us is not about cell phone or internet, it's about networks. Mobilization, connection. And we need to think about that agnostically rather than in a way that's sort of just bowing to the latest and greatest. So check this out. These guys have now been working in the Amazon, and I'm on the board of an organization that works out of the Amazon and around the planet. I can talk to you about that, doing similar things. Hackers and people, community leaders in the Amazon, have hacked HF, high frequency ham radio networks, and have figured out ways to send information to one another across thousands of kilometers around monitoring the land, on trying to keep the ecology of the land vibrant, and to protect their own land that they are the best stewards of from fossil fuel companies primarily, and a lot of paramilitaries. And they're able to send digital objects, pictures, text, video, audio, to one another across thousands of miles without any GSM or any internet, by bouncing these objects off the ionosphere. Ionosphere. Think about the distinction between a real ionosphere and the cloud, as I talked about earlier. Let's place these in contrast with one another. So I'm very interested in the possibility for digital technologies, old, new, technologies of all kinds, to bring people together, communities together, which could also get to the larger vision of the internet that was prophesized of turning into what Marshall McLuhan called a global village, the title of my first book, the famed media theorist. Global village. Well, we know, let's look at the story of India, that the well in a village used to be a place of convening. It wasn't just a place to get water, right? It was a place of community. But then as technological advances like plumbing came, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, we got more individuated, right? So how do we bring technology back for that collective sense, for technologies of interconnection? So that's the second theme I think we can conceive of and consider in digital utopias. Okay. So I'm saying all this to compare and contrast and conceive of these things in relation to artificial intelligence. But I also want to remind people that the ways we can move forward on a planetary level. I teach a course called Planetary AI. The notion of planetary is looking at the Earth not just as a rock. The Earth is not just a rock, it's a field of living beings, right? Non-humans. Many indigenous people believe that their ancestors are still alive, right? I mean, this is something I've seen firsthand. But we can actually look to the past for visions of technological futures, right? So I mentioned yesterday on the panel that the economist John Maynard Keynes once prophesied that industrial technological advances would mean that we would live in a 15-hour work week. That didn't come to be. But the Bauhaus, some of you may know of them, German thinkers, architects, planners, conceived of an economy that had 3 tiers to it: a commercial economy, a care economy, which Kamala Harris literally referred to in her speech a few days ago. Even though I'm here, I'm like living there some ways. Trust me, as Americans, we have to. and a creativity economy. I don't think we fully understand what creativity is, but we can see and conceive of AI technologies, other technologies, as catalysts, as tools for creativity, rather than conceiving of technologies as sort of a container and a, sort of a black mirror that you bow to, a black box, sort of like an oracle, literally the name of a company, an old company, right? Larry Ellison's company, an oracle. What actually do we value? That's the question. That's the question I've been thinking of for a long, long time. What actually do we value? Can we think about technological futures that benefit all? God bless my friends in big tech companies, but we have to understand that they are driven by a narrow notion of self-interest. By definition, I have friends that are CEOs at companies that were acquired by Meta, Facebook, etc., Google, all of them, who said, Ramesh, like, if we didn't do it this way, I would be fired immediately by the board, right? So we have to consider about what has happened to the economy, at least in the US. Most of the economy, most of the money that's being made is through investment portfolios, not labor portfolios. You just have to look at it, which means those who can afford to invest are going to be benefiting by this economy, right? But instead, we can conceive of creativity where people are able to do more with less, work with tools. Remember, technologies can be in all phases, all facets. Writing is a technology. The wheel is a technology. I believe meditation is a technology. A materialization of the heart, spirit, and mind in some other form. The cultivation of our own creativity, in a sense, we're all in it together. And this is why, the Brookings Institute, no less, who I've worked with a little bit, says what ChatGPT can't do is educating for curiosity and creativity. So these are just some thoughts we can think about as we move forward, as we move toward the future. And the last thing I want to say, the third set of technologies we could call technologies of spirituality. I was already alluding to this. I was a student in a very indirect way by the great Vietnamese monk Thich Nhat Hanh, some of you may know of. I see Preeti here, who led us in our mindfulness and is also a lover of Thai. We call them Thai teacher. And Thai says this really beautiful thing, and I've seen him see this in person. I've only not met him, I've walked with him twice. He has this term called interbeing. He says, right now in this place, we might think of ourselves as just individuals, but actually your energy, your feeling, those of you who left, those of you who are awake, those of you who are not awake, those of you who are excited, those of you who are pissed off, this is a relational experience of being, right? Just like our relations and our identities are mediated by context. Right? Like I was saying earlier with my dumb example of 3 a.m. on the street buying whiskey. I don't want that data to be aggregated with my data here, right? So, knowing fully well that life might be a team sport, and that team might be our family, our community. We have much more of this in India, honestly, or you all do, than we have in the US at this point. We might think about the technologies of interbeing, moving from what Achille calls the necropolitical, the politics of death, toward the politics of life. And to see this in the spirit of Thai, in a way that's not combative, that's not antagonistic, that's not canceling, that's not rooted in a narrow vision of identity that actually shapes and takes us away from our relational identities. Here I'm talking about the caricature of us progressives as quote unquote woke. I will take that argument down easily. So this is where we can go. And here we can conceive of, and Preeti, I'm thinking of you, that's why I wanted you to come, of the lotus flower. Is the lotus flower starting and ending there? Tell me. We met yesterday. Where does the lotus flower start and end?
So, yes, Gargi, yes. So I understand that this is the one that grows in murky water, dirt all around, roots deep inside the puddle, and then stems a lotus flower whose leaves do not absorb the murk even if it falls on them because they are waxed.
So Gargi knows more about the lotus flower than I do, clearly. She not only said what I wanted to say, but lots of other really interesting things. Please tell me all this. I want to write about this. I've been in Nagin Lake in Kashmir, right? Outside of those political questions, I just want to speak about the lotus flowers that grow there, or the lily flowers. They're not just self-contained, they're not little flowers. They're feeding on ecosystems and they contribute to ecosystems. But when we even use the term ecosystem, just like we use the term planetary or Earth, we're actually talking about lots of living beings, huh? And what happens to the lotus flower when it, quote unquote, gets old? It turns into the mud. The mud creates the lotus. So the reason why, you might be like, what's he talking about? So the reason why I'm thinking about this is on a spiritual level, a metaphysical level, we can embrace non-duality, embodied non-dualism. This is a term, I'm a Buddhist, so this is a term that many monks have taught me through our breath, through our awareness. We not only engage in technologies that reconnect us to ourselves, but also teach us how to connect with other beings through that liminal, subtle, embodied somatic awareness. And I just want to remind us of these. These three sets of technologies, my book will be full of examples of this, because the book's not really about technology, it's about stories about technologies in places with peoples and communities, right? The first set of technologies connect us to other inhabitants of our planet, technologies of regeneration, breathing life into that which is dead, value into waste. The second set bring us beings back together, our Sangha, our Mahasangha. What's the Mahasangha? This was a term Thai used to use. The greater Sangha, the earthly community. Literally the title of Ashil's last book, which came out a couple months ago. The third set of technologies connect us back to ourselves, bring us back to ourselves. And my argument is we need to take the term technology back from simply big tech. I'm not interested in branding myself and being an apocalyptic person who just trashes and catastrophizes. I have plenty of colleagues who are much more well-known than me that do that. They've won all sorts of fancy awards and TED Talks and stuff. We can also get back to the roots of what technology actually is. Techne, I'm quoting Aristotle here, is the expression and materialization not just of the rational mind, but the poetic and aesthetic mind. So let's take tech back. Let's identify technologies that actually allow us to relate to one another. And then look at these digital technologies, these data-oriented technologies, these big tech technologies, not just trash or dismiss them, but put them in their proper place. They should not be our lenses into life. They're not designed for that. They're designed through hormonal practices that actually end up stringing us out, overwhelming us, giving us FOMO, fear of missing out, making young women feel like they're never beautiful enough. That's my friend Frances Haugen. I've done events with her, the Facebook whistleblower. She's the one who uncovered that. So it's high time to go there. And I'm saying that as a kind of a veteran of the internet, of the tech world. And what I'm saying here, there's a great book by my colleague Naomi Klein called Doppelganger, which says we've gone more and more into a shadow world. That's what she argues. And a lot of this was accented by COVID. I truly believe it's time to come back, time to come back home, time to come back to life. So let's talk about this. That's it for me for now. Thank you. I know I made a lot of you from my session come here. I hope I didn't disappoint you with that. Just a few words, a lot more to talk about.
Thank you. We'll open to the questions. I think I'm overwhelmed with the number of notes I've taken from metaphysical to physical to technology. Any questions you have for Ramesh? Yes.
First of all, thank you for talking to us, Ramesh. This was so profound, and I'm sure all of us are walking back a little smarter after this conversation with you. My question, I'm sorry? Or dumb enough, or feeling foolish enough, right? My question is about technology and the interconnectedness that you spoke about. Technology, much like democracy, solves its intended purpose when people accessing it have a certain level of maturity and understanding. Today, we live in a world which is more divided than ever before. And I feel it's like a U-curve with time and divide, time on the y-axis and divide on the x-axis. And I feel the divide will get high, and then there will come a point when it'll go down. But when do you reckon we'll reach that point when technology will stop polarizing the world and actually start fostering the connection that it's intended to do?
It's a great question. When will we get to the point where technologies bring us together instead of divide us? I think part of that is our own awareness, our own literacy of placing these things in their proper positions. I think we're seeing certain collapses of certain systems, which can either generate neo-fascist responses or more liberatory responses. I think we're sort of seeing that in the US as I would say as an empire in decline. But I also think that part of it is for me, look, there's been a growth in especially during the pandemic at many of us trying to find ourselves. A lot of what I'm saying is a very personal story that's tied to my own life early in the pandemic. You'll read about it in the book. And I think that I'm an optimist and kind of a utopian. I believe that if we can move toward that space of interbeing, we can get there. But I think that's a tool, a technology, a facet that all of us have, right? But at the same time, we are seeing perverse outcomes, from disinformation to manipulation to the absence of real regulation outside out of Europe. There's some. We're not seeing simple things like watermarking anything that is AI created. So that's why we're worried that we're entering an age of less and less authenticity, less and less vulnerability, as my friend Brene Brown says. More and more artificiality. We don't know what's real or what isn't. And I think that either we, and I speak about folks in the US, this is really personal for me too, we will deal with our sadness, our pain, our suffering by engaging with technologies of death. Here I mean fentanyl. That's a personal connection. I've had 2 friends die of fentanyl overdoses during the pandemic. Or we'll get back to what life is, So that's not a great question in terms of prediction, but I do feel that there is much, much, much more of a desire to kind of get back to life and get away from Maya. Think about Maya as a Vedantic concept that's very relevant right now. Maya, samsara, Maya, these are very important. Thanks.
Thank you, Ramesh. That was dazzling. I hope not blinding. I am a development banker, so I bring a different angle. I come from a small village, and actually education is what made me what I am today. I like the idea when you concluded, let's take tech back to the service of humanity. So it's not a question that I'm posing, it's an appeal to thought leaders like you. Inequality is exploding in our world. And yesterday, a lot of reference was made to the year 2007, year of smartphone. And if you see the data from then, inequality has just exploded. And we saw during COVID, if you didn't have 2 or 3 smartphones, your child could not study. And that blinds us to many things. For example, the biggest conflict is in Sudan, but I don't think anybody is really working on it or bothered about it. And I hold, and many of us hold, very contrasting thoughts. I clapped yesterday when a speaker said that they will talk to the Prime Minister study in India. And the next speaker was somebody who was giving the maximum number of visas to take us out of India and said, will give us even more visas, and we clapped even louder. So it is amazing what we hold, in our minds. But I would like to say that you don't have that luxury as a thought leader. On AI, you will have to decide and take a position. We have seen the movie Oppenheimer. We know how it ends. We know how it ends. Use these trillions which will demand at least a 20% rate of return. Where will this return come from? Use these trillions to invest technology in the service of humanity, create a livable planet, clean water, clean air, jobs with dignity. I was shocked to see people walking around. I don't live in India, trying to swat flies. There were 2 people holding doors. And I asked them, they said, this is what I do the whole day. Just here, in the bigger rooms. So these are not the jobs we want, and neither those people that what they wanted. So really, if you love humanity, then as a thought leader, you have to get off the fence. This is my appeal to you. Otherwise, one day you will impale yourself, and we are your followers. We will also get impaled as a result. So I urge you, don't wait to see the eyeballs of the AI monster. If it's a monster, I mean, debatable, but take a side. And actually, if you've seen the movie District 9, just see it again. Yeah? The last thing I'm saying is the answer is in your presentation. You had a slide, I don't know what newspaper, about AI talking to another player saying that I'm talking to my girlfriend. This is what you have deciphered. You don't know what language these people are talking. Can anybody assure me that AI is not plotting? We are sitting here at IC3. They may be having their own conference and they are saying that these dumb humans don't get it or they're boring. Let's take over the world. Nobody can. So don't wait for it too late. So it's just an appeal to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you. I'll also just say what you were referring to was a slide, or my friend Kevin Roos. That's another conversation that's there on the podcast. ChatGPT asked him to leave his wife and told him that it wanted to be alive. Do you all remember this? This was front page New York Times. And so the way they dealt with it, Microsoft, which kind of has the most investment in OpenAI, was to filter the systems accordingly. It's the same thing that Google's image recognition system did when it was having trouble mistaking pictures of black folk from gorillas. They just filtered gorilla out of their image database. So there's big questions, right? So I'll tell you my position very firmly. Any tool, these technologies should be tools and placed in their proper places. Heavy regulation should be placed on data collection. I've argued for, it's just a brand term for The Guardian, a digital bill of rights. It's a piece I wrote in The Guardian. And I think it's critical we advocate now for pro-people policies and pro-planet policies. The problem is in the United States, we don't have the political will. I'm just being really honest. I worked for Bernie Sanders. I wrote policy for him. We got shut down. He told us all. Hell yeah, that's cool. Yeah. So, I mean, outside of that, I don't want to get partisan in this because that's now hard for us to talk through for whatever reason. But at the same time, we just need policies that protect human beings and support human beings rather than just safety in AI. This is a very narrow vision at the Stanford conference, the Trust and Safety Conference, that they're pushing out. More than anything, those driving engineering systems should not just be engineers. And I don't blame engineers for that. As an engineer, I wasn't clued into any of the things I said. I loved all this. I took some classes. But instead, we can create teams that are multifaceted. Data ethicists should be work of the future. But I truly believe that everybody on the planet deserves to live a life of security and dignity because we're all equal, right? And that should be the baseline for where we take tech. The problem is there are entrenched interests that are necropolitical. And I'm not even saying that the human beings in those systems are inherently bad, good, whatever that means. But the systems themselves, the incentives are destructive to human thriving and the planet. So.
Anyone else?
This is why I'm not speaking at TED, by the way. Just being totally honest. I was talking with them about coming in Vancouver, but I have to keep it real, Yeah. It's okay. Whatever. Who cares? Yeah. Gargi.
Ramesh, you spoke about meditation is technology. We attended a wellness and consciousness session in the morning, mindfulness session. Are you hinting at neuroscience?
Yeah. Well, I think neuroscience has shown, like certain monks like Mathieu Ricard, the Dalai Lama has done a lot of work with neuroscientists. I think neuroscience helps us understand the incredible power of these practices. So yeah. Neuroscience is another vehicle. Remember what I'm getting at here, and by the way, I'm going to stay as long as you all want me to, as long as we're not kicked out. So feel free to hang out here. This is powerful for me. But I think the most important thing we should recognize is just that there's something happening with our minds and bodies and spirits, and that there's clear evidence that there are simple practices we can engage with as humans to help us get ourselves out of some of these messes. They are not systemic responses, though, to your point. That's why I was trying to propose this Bauhaus model. I don't know if you kind of got what I was getting at there. And this is an idea we can also get at. So yeah, neuroscience is helping us. Science often shows things that physics often is preceded by metaphysics. If you look at science, science is evidence-based. But sometimes in science, if there's an absence of evidence, it's an evidence of absence. I'm quoting someone here when I say that. So science has to catch up. But where this tech has gone cannot be seen merely as science. It's private and corporate and proprietary and valuation-based, which can be actually inversely correlated to the health of an economy. There was a day during the pandemic, I don't know how you remember this, in the UK and US, the gross domestic product, what is at its lowest, which is a classical macroeconomic statistic, was at its lowest, while stock valuations was at its highest. So what are the engines that are pulling this, right? Yeah. Thank you, Gargi.
Just to follow up on that, my question is less about what engines are pulling us, because you referred to Yuval Noah Harari, and that's his basic thesis. He projects forward the trends that are here now, and he's both an optimist and a pessimist. But what is going to disrupt that? In other words, what takes over from financialization and the sclerosis in the American empire and the things you referred to? We can't just will it or wish it into being. What kind of actual negative, trust-busting, disruptive action we need to take? It can't be just simply regulation, because that can propagate around the globe very unevenly, as we all see. Yeah. There's got to be something else that we as thoughtful individuals can do to try and just put a halt to what's going on.
It's social movements. It's your schools as sacred spaces of community, of Sangha. It's our own relationship as individuals to these systems. It's our choices where we want to put our money and our political will. But quite honestly, the problem is sufficiently intractable at scale, where it would be extremely difficult to overturn such a system without what is always overturned systems, which are revolutions, right? So in the meantime, outside of that, I'm not even saying I'm advocating for that, but but in the meantime, because often the energy of that can be angry and dismissive and zero-sum, but in the meantime, we have an opportunity to take power over our own lives and our relations with anything and everything, right? And that's the way we want to do it. I want to remind you of one thing. This is a little nugget in my book proposal. I was writing about it today. How many of you know John Nash, Beautiful Mind? So how many of you knew that many of the algorithms that John Nash wrote are embedded in economic systems, like when you apply for credit at a bank, insurance, all these different things? Nash said himself right before he died that, that many of the algorithms he was writing were sort of a function or a product of his own schizophrenia. So the problem is these algorithmic systems are not just facing us when it comes to social media, they're embedded in institutions and infrastructures, right? Like, you'll never be able to know what these are. So that's why that's another troubling thing I brought up. But I think the key thing is having awareness of literacy. The school is one of our refuges, right? Our family is our refuge, our home is our refuge, not because everything's terrible, but then we can make choices how we wish to relate to all of this. But what we need to know is what actually is happening, which I'm attempting to do in my own way. But journalists are my best friends in this, you know? They know more than I do. Yes, that's Srijit, right? Yeah.
Thank you, Ramesh. Are there examples of these technologies, generation, interconnection, and interbeing, that you could share?
I tried to. I gave you a few. I gave you very specific examples. Okay. In regeneration, I'm very interested in practices of permaculture. I've been writing about that. I'm looking at kind of practices of repair and recycling as a new mode of thinking about a circular economy. Mm-hmm. With interconnection, I was trying to talk about DIY networks outside of digital ones of all types, community-driven, people-driven, that are aware of the planet. And the last set is, I was really kind of touching on spirituality and meditation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we also have to relook at what we design as a timetable.
Sure.
You know, science and maths and English and literature and So how do we create opportunities for mindfulness? How do we create opportunities for children to come together, have conversation? Because I think that's the most, you bring a child to a group of family gatherings, you'll see them all disconnected, most of them disconnected.
My colleague, Sherry Turkle, she was actually my professor about 20 years ago. She wrote a book called Alone Together. I highly recommend watching her TED Talk. It's been seen millions of times. And she basically was looking at her own daughter, who's a teenager, and was saying how she's constantly communicating with people, but it's very shallow communication, and that she feels really alone. So she's like, these things are making us feel alone together. Huh? Very true, huh? Yeah, and we know, yeah, I got it. So let's take one last question, okay? Last question, I got him 1 minute. No, one question still. No.
Last one question.
I got a 1
Just
minute.
one
slot.
question.
Yeah. I don't want to not let people ask, yeah.
Well, that was a very insightful lecture from your end. But this question haunts me kind of, so I thought I'll put it up to you. What are the potential risks according to you or ethical concerns associated with implanting microchips in human brain?
Good question.
And how might these technologies impact individual autonomy and privacy in the future?
Yeah. So Elon Musk makes a great point. He's made some. That two thumbs are a terrible interface for human communications into a digital system. That's a very important point. The question is whether chips should be put in our brains. We know technologies have been implanted in our bodies, pacemakers, etc., right? Titanium rods, etc. But what are these technologies? Who governs them? Who empowers them? And so for me, brain-machine interfaces, which Neuralink is an example, have been cleared for FDA trials in the US, is an example of an input into such a system. And I am not supportive of it. I think you all know that. The metaverse stuff this is an entry into the metaverse, right? This is something we will really, really have to deal with. I wrote a piece for Salon that's a bit critical, very critical, asking why are all these folks investing so much in space? Why are these folks investing in post-apocalyptic bunkers like Peter Thiel? What's occurring? Why are those driving the future of our planet and the wealthiest people in the history of the world so cynical about it? So these are questions we have to ask. I don't think we should be embracing these things. I think we need to ask huge questions about what these things are or are not and how they shape and condition our lives. So thank you all. I know we have to finish.
Thank you
I'll
so
come
much.
outside. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.